I've spent most of my time over the last decade of my life looking at the bones of children who died around 50,000 years ago. Specifically, my area of interest is Neanderthals and the very first modern humans. Researchers have been studying this time period and the origin of our species for over 100 years, but more often than not, they've gotten caught up in talking about fossils that look like this guy, by which I mean fully mature, autonomous adults. The problem is, when you talk about adults and what adults do, you're missing out on what a large segment of any given population is actually doing. Adults don't just pop out of nowhere, and the path that leads to adulthood, the one we call childhood, is actually pretty darn interesting. On the surface, spending a good portion of your 20s locked in a museum with a bunch of teeny tiny skeletons probably sounds pretty morbid, but actually it isn't. I'm not really preoccupied with death in general, or dead babies in particular. What I am a little obsessed with is what the lives of children in the past were really like. Human beings are unique in having this really long period of extended growth where they're dependent on adults. The fascinating part to me, though, is that over the last 100,000 years, there's been incredible variation in how to actually get that important job of becoming an adult done. I think there's a lot to be learned about what childhood means today by looking at what children meant during the last ice age. The problem, of course, is making that giant leap between what we have, which in most cases is a collection of burials, grave goods, and some fairly fragmentary human remains, to broader implications about childhood, behavior, and society. Now, sometimes there's a lot to work with. This is a burial of a 17-year-old that I worked with in Italy. The Italians call him El Princepi, or the Prince. And it's a pretty elaborate burial, presumably marking a highly valued group member. The tiny shells around his head were once sewn into a hat, and the red pigment you're looking at is called ochre and would have covered his entire body. And other times there's almost nothing to work with. This is all that's left of what appears to be 4 or 5 tiny babies from the French site of Cro-Magnon. There isn't much I can tell you about these guys, other than the fact that they died shortly after they were born, and they represent some of the very first modern humans to ever occupy Europe. Now, lately I've been thinking a lot about 2 early modern human children from a site in Sungir, Russia, which is located just a couple of 100 kilometers away from Moscow, and dates to 26 or 27,000 years ago. It's mostly famous for its incredibly complex burials that are rich in really unusual grave goods and well-preserved skeletons. One of the adults from Sungir, a male in his late 50s or early 60s, wore ivory bracelets around his wrist and was again covered in red pigment. He was also buried with more than 3,000 mammoth ivory beads, many of which appear to be sewn onto clothing. Archaeologists estimate that the beads alone probably would have taken over 3,000 hours to carve. It's the kids, though, of course, that interest me. A 13-year-old male and a 9-year-old female buried head-to-head in one of the most elaborate and plain old strange burials from this time period. In a brilliant stroke of total unparalleled weirdness, someone included just a single human leg bone of a third individual with these guys and stuffed the bone with more ochre. In addition, there are long and short spears, over 5,000 more bone beads, more than 250 fox teeth, and a variety of grave goods like this horse figurine. Despite the fact that they're young, these 2 children were extremely important to someone, and likely valued by the whole social group, which makes the bodies of the children themselves so very interesting. Who were these kids, and what were their lives like? At a basic level, the answer seems to be not terribly easy. The young girl, in particular, shows signs of disease and nutritional stress. Her teeth were covered with lines and ridges that anthropologists call enamel hypoplasias. They're basically defects in the enamel that are most often caused by periods of disease and starvation. The body is essentially interrupted during tooth formation and then resumes growth again when resources improve. And while I know that none of you are actually osteologists, let me assure you of one important fact. This is not what your leg bones are supposed to look like, okay? These are her femora, the bones of her upper legs, and they're incredibly bowed and distorted. It seems likely that this was some sort of birth defect, but we aren't terribly certain what caused it or how much it would have affected her mobility. And it gets even weirder, okay? Here are her upper arms. Not only are they totally healthy, but in spite of her disabilities, they're the arms of an extremely strong, physically active child. We can tell this because your bones are basically just like your muscles. The more activity you do, the more bone your body lays down. So we can look at the thickness of the bones and draw some conclusions about what types of activity she was actually engaging in. And the thing I can tell you is how incredibly asymmetrical her arms are. The right one, the dominant one, is substantially stronger than her left. Lots of children from this time period show this pattern, and at a very early age. They were probably doing something pretty intense with their arms, which shouldn't surprise us because we know that children in other societies are actively training to contribute to their group at an early age. They have to, actually, because the tasks that they need to accomplish as adults are highly skilled and physically demanding. For example, early modern humans hunted with a weapon called an atlatl, or a spear thrower. With the help of an atlatl, even small and weak individuals can propel a dart over 100 yards. But here's the kicker. If you haven't practiced it from early childhood, it's almost impossible to hit anything with. Believe me, I've tried. Skills like these would have taken years to master, and individuals almost certainly started training in the form of what they would have thought of as play. It's probably one of the hazards of my profession that when I see American children now, I end up thinking about the Sangir kids with their elaborate graves and their bodies that remained active even in the face of disease. Today we do our best to protect our children, not only from the horrors of the modern world, but from the bumps and bruises of daily life. But recent psychological research indicates that overcoming challenges and even minor injuries during childhood often leads to a more stable, anxiety-free outlook in adulthood. This suggests that maybe the sanitized, sheltered world we create for our kids isn't ideal. And while no one in their right mind would suggest exposing them to what the Sangir kids experienced, I think our kids are a whole lot tougher than we take them for. Thanks.